Hello, my name is Alan Madison and I'm an architect with the Office 365 Center of Excellence. Today's session, meetings. It's important to remember that features and functionality change over time. Microsoft is committed to continually improving Skype for Business, and as such, features and functionality will be added. By the time you watch this training, new features may well have been added. However, we are committed to ensuring that you have access to the most recent training that is current and relevant, so for major updates we will release new training. However, to be sure that you are watching the most recent version of this training, please visit skypeoperationsframework.com/academy. In today's session we're going to talk about all things meetings. We'll start with an introduction to meetings where we'll talk about core concepts and components so that we have a solid foundation to discuss other topics such as conference joins and scheduling, planning, architecture, conferencing administration. Introduction to meetings. In Introduction to Meetings, we're going to discuss all of the core concepts and components so that we have a solid foundation from which to build and discuss other topics related to Skype for Business meetings. Perhaps the most basic concept that we need to describe, first of all, is meetings itself. When we talk about meetings, what are we actually referring to? Well, we're actually referring to a wide variety of capabilities. Perhaps the most basic of those are web meetings. We're all familiar with web meetings. They support up to 250 users. They include functionality such as audio, video, whiteboarding, Q&A, polls, application desktop sharing, and of course PowerPoint presentations. Supported across a wide variety of devices and platforms including Windows, Mac, and iOS and Android. They can be scheduled or ad hoc and support up to 250 attendees. But we're also referring to Pstn Conferencing. Pstn Conferencing has been available in both Skype for Business on premises and online for some time now. Microsoft as a conferencing provider is much more recent, and we're going to talk about some of the capabilities that Microsoft have introduced with their cloud Pstn conferencing service. But again, we're also talking about meeting broadcast. Meeting broadcast is a new feature available to Skype for Business Online and Skype for Business hybrid deployments. It supports up to 10,000 attendees and provides live streaming of audio and video. And finally, we're going to talk about Skype room systems. One of the key philosophies of Microsoft is to provide a consistent and excellent user experience regardless of their device. And this philosophy has extended into the conference room, where we've launched Skype room systems that will support a number of different existing audio and video devices so that users can maintain that consistent and familiar Skype for Business experience. While we've just described meetings at a high level, it's important to understand from a technical perspective what we mean by a meeting within the context of Skype for Business. Meetings are always hosted on the home pool of the organizer, and this is an important consideration when you are planning your conferencing deployment. Any scheduled meeting will always be a meeting regardless of the number of participants. So for example, if you have a user and they leverage the Outlook add-in for Skype for Business to schedule a Skype for Business meeting, then that meeting will always be hosted on the home pool of that user. A peer-to-peer session will automatically become a meeting if whiteboard, Q&A, or polling functionality is used regardless of the number of participants. And finally, an ad hoc meeting involves 3 or more participants. So in this scenario, imagine you have a peer-to-peer call between 2 colleagues. During the call, they escalate from audio to audio and video, and then they realize they need to add a 3rd colleague. By dragging in that 3rd colleague, they immediately escalate that peer-to-peer session to a meeting that's hosted on the home pool of the organizer. Taking these concepts a little further, it's important to know that once you have a meeting, all media streams in that meeting will be multiplexed by a multi-point conferencing unit running on the Skype for Business servers. Using our last example, we see that in a peer-to-peer call, we have media flowing directly between participants. Once that peer-to-peer call is migrated to a meeting, perhaps by the addition of a 3rd person, those media streams will now flow through the MCUs running on the Skype for Business servers. There are actually 4 MCUs, and I'm going to talk about those over the next 4 slides. The first MCU is the IM MCU. Now, many of you will already know that for instant messages, we leverage SIP as a transport protocol. So the actual IM conversation is carried within SIP. However, it's important to remember that in a conference, while the IMs will still leverage SIP as a transport protocol, multiplexing will still occur on the IM MCU. And what that means is that for a participant who sends an IM to a conference, that IM will be received and distributed by the MCU running on the Skype for Business front-end server. The data MCU is used for functionality such as whiteboarding, polls, Q&A, and file sharing. And of course, in Skype for Business Server 2015, it will also interact with the Office Online server for sharing of PowerPoint presentations. In earlier versions, such as Link Server 2010, of course, the data MCU was responsible for rendering the PowerPoint, but that changed with the introduction of Link Server 2013. The AV MCU is perhaps the most complex of the MCUs in that it supports both mixing audio and switching video. Within the context of video, there are two codecs supported, H.264 SVC or scalable video coding and RTVC1, which is real-time video. This real-time video, of course, was the video codec native to Link Server 2010. And typically you would only expect to see real-time video being sent to Link 2010 participants. In addition, the MCU is responsible for smart cropping. Smart cropping is the manipulation of a video stream to a square aspect ratio centered on the user participating. This square aspect ratio is of course critical to the inclusion in the gallery view, which includes up to 5 video streams. The sender video simulcast is optimized for receivers. What this means is that imagine a scenario where we have four participants. You may have a Windows desktop client participating and they may request 1080p 30 frames per second video. You may have a laptop user that perhaps isn't as powerful and only can handle 720p at 15 frames per second, and perhaps a mobile client which will request 180p at 15 frames per second. The key here is to remember that when the video stream is being optimized for the receivers, it's based on the actual participants sending their capabilities to the AV MCU. The actual video stream center is of course based on Active Speaker. Active Speaker is a simple algorithm to determine where there is an audio signal coming from. And of course, critical to meeting administration, conferencing administration is media quality reporting. The AV MCU compiles QoE data and sends that to the reporting server. The application sharing MCU is of course responsible for multiplexing media streams from desktop sharing or application sharing. Again, there are two different capabilities supported. RDP or remote desktop protocol encapsulated in real-time protocol, or video-based screen sharing using H.264. Video-based screen sharing is a relatively recent introduction to Skype for Business Server, and it's only used in a situation where application or desktop sharing is for display purposes only. The moment you have remote control of an application sharing session, then the clients will fall back to RDP in order to facilitate remote control. And of course, like the AV MCU, the application sharing MCU supports quality of experience data and reporting that data back to the reporting server. The next important concept that we need to understand are the conference protocols. Protocols are critical to communication between the client and conferencing server and components within the conferencing server. The Centralized Conferencing Control Protocol, or C3P, is an XML-based protocol that's responsible for conference control and state modification tasks. C3P is carried through SIP inside SIP info or SIP service requests. For many of us, the most common scenario in which we would need to know a little bit about C3P is in a troubleshooting scenario. For example, since we know C3P is carried through SIP, if you were to look at the SIP client-side logs, you would actually see C3P commands. So for example, if we're troubleshooting a conference join issue, we would be looking for the add user C3P command in the SIP trace. The Persistent Shared Object Messaging Protocol is a web conferencing protocol used for exchanging data, collaboration, content, and control, and is typically embedded in a TLS channel. The Session Initiation Protocol is critical to Skype for Business as a whole, not just to meetings. Within the context of meetings, it's important because it carries C3P commands as well as carries STP or Session Description Protocol information for media negotiation. And finally, Real-Time Transport Protocol. This is the protocol used to carry audio and video media. Now let's take a more detailed look at the various conferencing components and the boundaries with which they operate. On the front-end server, of course, we see the focus factory, and the various MCUs that we've already discussed. And then in terms of web components which run on IIS, we have the Join Launcher and the Unified Communications Web API. And of course, each front-end server has the RTC local database. Now, one important point to remember is that from an architecture perspective, these components are common to both Skype for Business on-premises and Skype for Business online. The components that run in the online environment, of course, have code that's been optimized for massively scaled environments, and the topology in which these components are deployed is not the same as on-premises, but fundamentally the components are common to both on-premises and online. Beyond the front-end server, of course, we have the file share. The file share stores meeting data as well as meeting metadata. We have the backend SQL database server, and of course we have Office Online Server, which is responsible for rendering PowerPoint presentations. Now we're going to go into more detail on all of these components over the next several slides. Let's take a look at those conferencing components in more detail. The focus. The focus is responsible for enlisting required conferencing servers. It authenticates participants before allowing them to enter a conference. It manages conference state and roster, and maintains and enforces conference policies. So if you think about a typical conference, you can see that the focus is actually a critical component to the entire process. For example, when you join a conference, it's the focus that's going to authenticate you as a participant. If you're in a conference, for example, and it's audio only and someone adds video, it would be the focus that would request access to an AV MCU in order to allow video to be added to the conference. And obviously, if people join and leave conferences, then the focus is responsible for updating the roster. Our next component is the focus factory. The focus factory is responsible for scheduling meetings. As a SIP entity, it creates, deletes, and modifies meetings in the conferencing database. These modifications are based on C3B commands issued by clients. An example of the SIP URI associated with the focus factory is shown on the screen. A good example of the importance of the focus factory is if we think about a scenario where a user is scheduling a meeting. As that meeting is scheduled using the Outlook add-in, for example, the Outlook add-in would communicate with the focus factory in order to ensure that a meeting entry was created in the conferencing database, as well as ensuring that an entry was created in the user's Exchange calendar. The conferencing server factory, also known as the MCU factory, is responsible for provisioning a conference for a particular media type on a conferencing server. It provisions meetings according to policies and the current load on the conferencing servers, and it's an application that runs on each front-end server and uses an HTTP interface. So let's talk about an example so we can have a better understanding of the role the conferencing server factory plays. Imagine a scenario where a user is in a conference and they decide to add audio and video. The user would then send that request to the focus. The focus would then send a request for an AV MCU to the conferencing server factory. Since each MCU in a pool has an affinity with the MCU factory would be able to make a determination as to which AV MCU it should leverage based on health notifications from those MCUs. Once it's made a determination as to which MCU it would use, it would then send that information back in the form of a SIP URI to the focus. The focus would then pass this to the client, and the client would then connect to the correct AV MCU. The conferencing database is used to store critical information related to conferences. The focus stores all conference state information in the RTC local database and is first written to the primary front-end server in a pool. This data is synchronously replicated to all secondary members of the Windows Fabric group. In addition, conference data per user is stored as an XML file in the SQL Server backend database, RTCXDS, and this data is used for the purposes of hydration of front-end servers in a failover scenario. Taken together, these capabilities allow for a natural failover model for high availability, as well as temporary loss of network connectivity from client to server. The conference metadata that is stored as part of the conference database is as follows: the conference ID, expiration date and time of the conference, list of meeting participant roles and the privileges associated with those roles, the conference keys for participants without an identity in Active Directory, supported media types, and authorization types such as closed, open, anonymous, or locked. Presence and registrar information and conferencing information are stored in different tables of the same physical database, RTC DYN. So now that we've learned about the core conferencing components, let's take a look at how all of these components interact with each other. 1. The client creates a conference. 2, the focus factory will take that meeting request and store it as conference data. 3, the client joins the conference. 4, the focus validates the conference and enforces policy, as well as authenticating the client prior to joining the conference. 5, the focus requests a conferencing server from an MCU factory. The MCU factory will take that request and make a determination as to which MCU it should pass back to the focus. Once this information has been passed back to the focus will bootstrap the conferencing server, and finally the conferencing client will establish a media session with the conferencing server. Conference scheduling. Many of us will already be familiar with the conference scheduling process, but let's take a look at it at a high level and we'll talk about some of the key options in more detail later on in the presentation. 1, a meeting invite is created. So imagine a scenario where we have a Windows user and they have Outlook 2016. They select to create a Skype for Business meeting. The Outlook add-in creates the meeting invite and offers a series of meeting options. Those meeting options include control of who waits in the lobby and who has direct access to the meeting. It determines who is a presenter, and it will allow you to also choose to disable IM or mute all attendees or block all video. Once the options have been configured and the meeting invite has been sent, server-side processes take over. On the Exchange side, a calendar event is created, and on the Skype for Business side, an entry in the conferencing database is created. Let's take a closer look at meeting configuration options. Perhaps the most important of these is access control. As you can see, we have 4 different types of access control. Access control determines which users will be permitted to enter the meeting directly and which users are restricted to the lobby and require a presenter to admit to the meeting. Our first meeting type is locked. Everyone but the meeting organizer will have to wait in the lobby, and of course the organizer will then have to admit them to the meeting. We have the invited only meeting type, where only users from the same company who are specifically invited will bypass the lobby. Then we have the company meeting type, where only users from the same company, regardless of whether they have been invited or not, are able to bypass the lobby. This specifically means that anonymous, federated, and Pstn callers that have not authenticated will be in the lobby. And then finally we have the everyone meeting type, where everyone can directly join the meeting. It's worth noting that if you do not select the everyone meeting type, then you have the ability to allow Pstn callers to bypass the lobby with a checkbox. It's not actually shown in the screenshot. Our next meeting configuration option are user roles. Within a Skype for Business meeting, there are 3 user roles: organizer, which is an implicit role, and presenter, which controls the meeting, and attendees. As you can see on the screen, when we configure the meeting options, we have the ability to determine who is going to be a presenter. We have 4 options. You can select from only you, the organizer, being a presenter. People that you select can be presenters. Anyone from your organization or anyone, no restrictions. It's worth noting that with the people I choose option, you're not able to select a federated user before they join the meeting. Of course, you can promote them to be a presenter once they have joined the meeting. Conference joins. At a high level, the conference join process is very simple. It begins with a meeting invite. For example, we have a Windows desktop user and they receive a meeting invite in Outlook. They're reminded to join the conference. They click on the URL in the meeting invite. This causes the Skype for Business client installed on their machine to launch and join the meeting. Whether you actually join the meeting or wait in the lobby is, as we've just seen with our discussion on access control, determined by the organizer at the time the meeting is created. When trying to understand about the join process, it's fundamental to understand how the meeting URL is constructed. On the screen, we have an example meeting URL. As we can see, it's composed of several different elements. These include the SIP domain. In our example, this is Microsoft.com. We have the organizer. In our example, this is Alan Marr. And then we have the conference ID, which is an alphanumeric string. From this, we can construct the organizer URI, which in our example is Alan Marr at Microsoft.com. Looking at the join process in more detail, we see that the actual join process is more complicated than it first appears. When the user joins a meeting, a DNS lookup has to be performed. From the DNS lookup, we get an IP address. The client then uses that IP address to send an HTTP GET request. The HTTP response from the join launcher running on the Skype for Business server is returned to the client, and at that point, the client is now joined to the meeting. Whether they are actually in the meeting or in the lobby will be determined by the access control meeting options. Recent updates. In response to user feedback, there have been some changes in the Outlook add-in to facilitate ease of use. The first change is in the Join by Phone hyperlink. As shown on the slide, the hyperlink now includes a comma, which represents a pause, followed by the conference ID. This change allows one-click join into the dial-in portion of the conference. It's important to note that there are requirements in order to take advantage of this update. The first is the meeting invite must be created using the Outlook 2016 Click-to-Run client. For an Office 365 user, the meeting organizer requires the cloud Pstn Conferencing license, and for an on-premises user, there are no server-side requirements. The second update is in addition to the meeting join URL. As you can see on the screen, there is now a URL that will allow a user to join via the web application. This is often useful if the user is having problems joining using the Skype for Business client. Conference Lifecycle. In terms of the conference lifecycle, there are two key concepts to be aware of. The first is conference activation and deactivation, and the second is conference expiration. Conference expiration is the process of deleting content related to the meeting as well as the metadata associated with the meeting. We're going to talk about that in later slides, but first we'll focus on activation and deactivation. Activation is instantiation of a conference and occurs when the first user joins the meeting. This process is controlled by the focus. Deactivation is the tearing down of a particular instance of the conference and is also controlled by the focus. Deactivation can happen manually or automatically, and for recurring meetings, meetings can be reactivated after the previous instance has been deactivated. Manual deactivation occurs as a result of user or administrative action. For example, in a situation where the user has ended a meeting using the exit and end conference command in the Skype for Business client, this has the effect of sending a delete conference to the focus, thereby resulting in a manual deactivation of the conference. Also, if a user were to delete a calendar event in Outlook, this has the same effect of sending a delete conference command to the focus factory, thereby deactivating that particular meeting. From an administrative perspective, if the organizer is disabled or deleted in Skype for Business, this also has the effect of causing conferences to be deactivated. While manual deactivation requires user or administrative action, automatic deactivation is a system-side process. The goal of this process is to ensure that resources are managed correctly across front-end servers. Specifically, it is designed to ensure that there are no runaway meetings. Automatic deactivation occurs under the following three circumstances. 1. 0 active participants in the conference. A participant is considered to be active in the conference if they are connected to a focus or at least one MCU. 2. 10 minutes elapses without an enterprise user in the conference. An enterprise user is defined as a user belonging to the company of the organizer. Federated users and anonymous users do not count as enterprise users. 3. 24 hours elapses without a new user joining the conference. Alongside conference activation and deactivation, conference expiration is another important concept when we consider conference lifecycle. Once a meeting has expired, no participants, including the organizer, can join the meeting. And meeting expiration occurs as follows. For a one-time scheduled meeting, expiration occurs 14 days after the scheduled end time. For an ad hoc meeting, expiration occurs 8 hours after the meeting end. And finally, for a recurring scheduled meeting, expiration occurs 6 months after the last meeting activation. As we previously discussed, an activation occurs when there is a user connected to the conference or at least one MCU. It's also important to note that meeting content is not deleted immediately. So once a conference has expired, there's actually a grace period. A grace period is 15 days and is calculated from the meeting expiration date. All conference data and conference metadata will be deleted at that time. Archiving. Archiving is a server-side function of Skype for Business Server and should not be confused with conversation history. Conversation history only provides the ability to store IM conversations in a user's mailbox. Archiving has a much more robust set of features and capabilities. So let's take a look at conference archiving in more detail. Perhaps most importantly, what is actually archived as part of conference archiving? There are three general content types that are archived. First, multi-party IM conversations. Secondly, conference content, including uploaded content, and lastly, polls and whiteboards that were shared during a conference. It's important to note that audio, video, and application sharing sessions are not archived as part of conference archiving. And finally, if you enable archiving, where is the content archived to? Well, it depends on whether you're using Skype for Business on-premises or Skype for Business online. If you're using Skype for Business online, conference content will be archived to Exchange Online. If you're using Skype for Business on-premises, you can use either Exchange on-premises or SQL Server. If you leverage Exchange either on-premises or online, Skype for Business conference archiving will leverage the Exchange archiving capabilities and in fact uses the in-place hold attribute to ensure the content is archived and stored in the mailbox. If you are required to archive for compliance reasons, it's important to understand that Skype for Business offers additional capabilities to ensure that you meet your legal requirements. Skype for Business Online supports turning off non-archive features such as file transfer, shared OneNote and PowerPoint presentations, while Skype for Business on-premises allows you to block features if archiving fails. Looking at the archive process in a little more detail, you can see with the following diagram that there are three critical components: the conference MCUs, the Skype for Business storage service, and the archiving target. The data MCU and the IM MCU are responsible for sending content that has to be archived to the Skype for Business storage service. The Skype for Business storage service in turn must archive that content to the configured archiving target, which could either be Exchange Server or SQL Server. The important point to note on this diagram is the absence of the AV MCU, because as we discussed, audio, video and application sharing sessions are not part of content that is archived. Planning considerations. Planning for Skype for Business conferencing can be a complex undertaking, and it is highly recommended that you spend the time to plan properly to ensure successful deployment. As you begin the planning process, consider the following. Which conferencing modalities will you be using? Will you be using web conferencing, AV conferencing, Pstn conferencing? Once you've made these decisions, you should be aware of the potential network impacts of enabling Skype for Business meetings. For example, AV conferencing, which uses real-time media such as audio and video, has a critical reliance on the network in order to ensure a quality experience for your users. We highly recommend that you consider using the bandwidth calculator tool, which is available from Microsoft.com, as well as the assets that are available from SkypeOperationsFramework.com. Taken together, these assets will help you model and test your network to ensure that you have some comfort level with the readiness as you begin the rollout of Skype for Business conferencing. Understanding the impact on the network of deploying Skype for Business conferencing is an important part of the planning process. However, there are other important questions that you need to ask and have answers for as you go through the planning process. For example, if you have an on-premises deployment of Skype for Business server, are you going to enable external users? External users will mean that you have additions to your infrastructure, as they require both edge servers and proxy servers. Do you have compliance requirements? Compliance means that you will have to enable archiving. If you have an on-premises deployment, you must determine the location of your users. We recommend that you distribute pools geographically to optimize media paths. Finally, if you have Skype for Business online deployment, you can take advantage of regional hosted meetings. We're going to discuss this new capability later on in the presentation. As you begin the planning process, don't forget to refer to www.skypeoperationsframework.com. There are a tremendous number of planning assets that will be invaluable to you as you go through this process. Office Online Server on-premises. Office Online Server, formerly known as Office Web App Server, was first introduced in Link Server 2013 as a result of issues with PowerPoint presentations in Link Server 2010. These issues included a dependency on Silverlight, as well as fidelity issues when the PowerPoint presentations were being rendered. As a solution, it presents PowerPoints leveraging DHTML and JavaScript. This of course means that there is broad cross-platform support for PowerPoint presentations in Skype for Business Server. Deploying Office Online Server is very straightforward. You simply add the Office Online Server to the topology, you associate a front-end pool with the Office Online Server and publish a topology. It's also worth noting that Office Online servers can be shared across pools, And for small deployments, perhaps where Office Online Server is dedicated to Skype for Business only, you can virtualize Office Online Server to minimize hardware costs. Now that we've been introduced to the Office Online Server, let's take a closer look at how it interacts with other web conferencing server components, specifically the Data MCU. The first step in the process is, of course, uploading the file. The presenter in a meeting will upload the PowerPoint file that is to be presented. As the file is uploaded, the Data MCU on the Skype for Business server is responsible for saving this file to the conferencing content file share. Once the presentation begins, a broadcast URL with a file ID and authentication token is sent to all participants in the meeting. Once these participants receive this broadcast URL, they use an HTTP GET request in order to begin the process of downloading the file. Passed as part of that GET request is, of course, the file ID and the authentication token. The Office Online Server then receives that request and passes it back to the web conferencing server running on the Skype for Business front-end server, which is responsible for retrieving the file from the conferencing content file share. Once the content has been retrieved, it is passed back to the Office Online Server, and this is broadcast out to meeting attendees. Simple URLs on premises. Simple URLs are used to publish web services in Skype for Business server. There are three different types of simple URLs. There is the meeting join URL, there is the dial-in URL, which is used to publish information and settings related to dial-in conferencing, and the admin URL, which is used to publish information for connections to the Skype for Business control panel. There are three deployment options for simple URLs. Shown on the screen, we list those as option 1, option 2, and option 3. It's worth noting that all options support multiple subdomains, but there are advantages and disadvantages to each approach, and we'll discuss those in a moment. First, let's take a look at option 1. As you can see, it supports multiple subdomains. In our example, these subdomains are contorso.com and fabricam.com. But it's also worth noting that regardless of how many subdomains you actually have, the dial-in URL and the admin URL only support a single subdomain. So in option 1, we see dialin.contorso.com and admin.contorso.com as the URLs used for the entire deployment, regardless of the number of subdomains. Looking more closely at the meeting join URL, we can see that this option allows us to have different base URLs for users in different subdomains. So for example, a user in the contorso.com subdomain would use meet.contorso.com as the base URL for meeting joins. Option 2 is a variant of option 1 in that it still supports multiple subdomains, but we use a common base URL for the subdomain and append the meet specific information. So in our example, we see skype.contorso.com/meet and skype.fabricam.com/meet. As with option 1, both the dial-in and admin URL still leverage only a single base URL. Option 3 offers the greatest flexibility in terms of large deployments with multiple subdomains. As you can see, it uses a common base URL regardless of the actual subdomain. In our example, this is skype.contorso.com, and you can see how the subsequent subdomains are appended to that base URL. So we have skype.contorso.com/contorso.com/meet and skype.contorso.com/fabricam.com/meet. The real benefit of option 3, and this is the recommended approach for large numbers of subdomains, is that it minimizes the number of DNS entries that are required to support your Skype for Business infrastructure. It will also minimize the number of entries required for your certificates. Conference data store on premises. If you're responsible for managing an on-premises Skype for Business infrastructure, it's important to understand, at least at some level, the role of the conference data store. The conference data store leverages the file share associated with your front-end server pool in Topology Builder and is used to store two different types of data. It stores actual content, for example, uploaded files, and it also stores content metadata. While it's not important to understand the specific folder structure on the file server, it is important to understand that the configuration options associated with the data store can have an impact on your conferencing environment. On the screen right now, we see the default values listed with the get-cs conferencing configuration commandlet. The maximum meeting file size is 500 megabytes. The meeting content storage maximum is also 500 megabytes, and the meeting content expiration is 15 days. Now, as you can see, each of those limits would actually potentially have an impact on your conferencing environment. So it's important to understand what the defaults are and that they actually can be changed using the set-cs conferencing configuration commandlet. High availability and disaster recovery on premises. Before we discuss high availability and disaster recovery in more detail, it's important that we define what we mean by high availability and disaster recovery. High availability is the ability to failover between servers in the same Skype for Business pool in a single site. So using as an example to discuss this in more detail, imagine a pool where we have 3 servers. High availability would mean that if we were to use server 3 in that 3-server pool, then the workloads associated with server 3 would fail over to servers 1 and 2. Disaster recovery is the ability to fail over between different Skype for Business pools and different physical sites. This is also known as site resiliency. An example of this would be an arrangement where we have site A and site B, and in site A we have a single pool, and in site B we have a single pool. We establish a pairing relationship between pools in site A and site B, and in the event that we have an issue with pool in site A, we can fail over services to the pool in site B. Now that we understand the concepts of high availability and disaster recovery, let's take a closer look at these capabilities within Skype for Business Server. Perhaps the most important consideration as it relates to high availability is the idea that you must ensure that all elements of your Skype for Business infrastructure are highly available. It is not sufficient to rely on the high availability of the front-end server pool itself. For example, you must ensure that SQL Server is always highly available. We do recommend SQL Server always on. You must also ensure that your file share is highly available, and we recommend DFS for high availability in this regard. Within the context of the actual front-end server pool infrastructure, high availability is managed by Windows Fabric. Windows Fabric as a technology recognizes the concept of a primary node, an active secondary node, and a passive secondary node. It is responsible for replicating data between all 3 of these nodes to ensure uninterrupted service. So, as an example, if the active node in a Windows Fabric group fails, it will seamlessly transition workloads to the active secondary in that Windows Fabric group, and it will also promote the passive secondary to active secondary to ensure that there is continued high availability as the former primary node recovers. Moving on to disaster recovery, we rely on the Skype for Business backup server to ensure that data is replicated between pools. There are 2 critical elements in a disaster recovery situation. The first is actual replication of data from front-end servers in Pool A to front-end servers in Pool B. Pool A and Pool B would be, of course, be in a pool pairing relationship. And it's also important to ensure that the SQL Server data is being replicated between sites. SQL Server data would be used for hydration in the event that you actually needed to perform a disaster recovery operation. The following table shows the key points that we just discussed in a little bit more detail. In the left-hand column, we have the conference data types. For example, we have scheduling data, we have dynamic conference data, we have the content file share, and we have a list of active conferences. The next 3 columns show the replication mechanisms to achieve high availability and disaster recovery. For example, in column 2, we show what data is replicated and how the data is replicated for an unexpected failure. In column 3, we have an interpool failover, which is planned. And then finally, in the 4th column, we have the replication mechanisms that are leveraged as part of disaster recovery. Disaster recovery for simple URLs can either be automated or manual. Automated disaster recovery requires the use of GeoDNS. GeoDNS is a function of DNS which permits distribution of load based on location and or availability. In the event that you do not have GeoDNS deployed, you can still achieve disaster recovery using manual intervention. This will require you to manually edit the DNS records and change the IP address with which the simple URLs are associated. Continuing our example, it's possible to see that if we don't have simple URL disaster recovery, when a user attempts to connect to a simple URL that points to a failed pool, they will be unable to join the meeting. Therefore, it's important to plan for disaster recovery. When we talk about disaster recovery in simple URLs, it's important to acknowledge that there are 2 options, the automated option and the manual option. The manual option requires an administrator to modify DNS entries manually in the event of a pool failure. And obviously this can be time consuming and may have an impact in terms of service outage. The automated approach to simple URL disaster recovery requires the use of GeoDNS. GeoDNS is a function of DNS which permits distribution of load based on location and or availability. In our example, the GeoDNS service would have detected the failure of pool 1, and when a DNS query was received for the meeting join URL, they would point the meeting participant to pool 2 based on knowledge of that pool failure, thereby ensuring that we've adequately ensured that there is no service outage. Regional hosted meetings. In Skype for Business Online, one of the challenges faced by users in multinational corporations has been the fact that they are restricted to a single geographic region. Within the context of conferencing, this has greatly increased the risk of quality issues related to network. As a solution to this, Microsoft has recently introduced regional hosted meetings. This new capability allows multinational corporations to home users in their geographic region. So for example, a tenant in North America is now able to ensure that users located in the Asia Pacific region are homed on Skype for Business Online servers in the Asia Pacific region. This, of course, dramatically reduces the potential issues related to network traversal. Let's look at the specifics in a little more detail. A single tenant can now span multiple Skype for Business Online Azure Active Directory forests. In our previous example, we talked about a North American tenant with users in the APAC region. Once those users are homed on the Skype for Business servers in the APAC region, it means that their user accounts are also part of the Azure Active Directory for the APAC region. However, we still allow tenant management through a single PowerShell session. The tenant admin can move and add users to any region, and there is no additional licensing required. Pstn Conferencing Online. Pstn Conferencing Online has been available for a number of years. Initially, it was available through audio conferencing providers such as PGI, Intercall, or BT. Customers would sign up with one of these providers and administration would be completed through the Skype for Business Administration Center. More recently, Microsoft has introduced the Cloud Pstn Conferencing service, where Microsoft becomes the Pstn conferencing provider. Once again, administration is conducted through the Skype for Business Administration Center. With the Microsoft Cloud Pstn Conferencing service, there are a series of default numbers. These default numbers are toll numbers and are available across multiple countries and multiple cities. On the screen right now, you see an example of a screenshot from the Skype for Business Administration Center showing the default Microsoft bridge numbers. In addition to selecting bridge numbers, it's also possible to configure at a tenant level specific settings for the Pstn conference experience. For example, you can enable meeting entry and exit notifications, and you can ask callers to record their names before joining the meeting. You're also able to specify the pin length in order to provide enhanced security. In addition to tenant level settings, you have the ability to set user settings. These include the default toll number. In our example on the screen, you see a number from Los Angeles has been selected. You also have the ability to set the default toll-free number. Toll-free numbers are considered to be service numbers and require Pstn consumption billing. We'll talk about Pstn consumption billing later on in the presentation. In addition, you have the ability to reset a user's conference ID, reset their PIN, and more importantly, you also have the ability to allow unauthenticated callers to be the first people in a meeting. If you check the box, then they will be able to join the meeting regardless of whether there is an authenticated user there or not. If the box remains unchecked, they will wait in the lobby until an authenticated user has joined the meeting. As we just discussed, toll-free numbers are considered to be service numbers and require consumption billing to be set up. The following screen shows a request to set up a toll-free number, and Pstn consumption has not been set up, so the request is denied. Pstn consumption billing is an important part of Skype for Business Online conferencing, as it provides the ability to have toll-free dial-in numbers as well as international dial-out capabilities. Setup is very straightforward. Select an initial prepaid balance amount, a minimum balance threshold, and a balance replenishment amount. Once you have funded the prepaid balance directly in the Office 365 portal, the service will be immediately available. Account balances will be drawn down as services are consumed. Usage reports related to billing will be available through the Admin Center at any time. Conferencing administration. Conferencing administration on premises. Conferencing administration on premises is achieved through either the PowerShell commandlets or the Skype for Business control panel. The current slide shows the get-cs Windows service commandlet used to identify the number of active conferences. The following slide shows two key PowerShell commandlets used in conferencing administration: the new -cs conferencing policy commandlet and the set-cs conferencing configuration commandlet. One of the most important benefits of Skype for Business Online is, of course, that meetings are provided as a service. This means that Microsoft is responsible for administrating and monitoring the health of your Skype for Business environment. Within the context of conferencing, this can be critically important to ensure that conferencing components are functioning as expected. If you are responsible for managing an on-premises environment, it's important that you understand the value of synthetic transactions. Synthetic transactions are PowerShell commandlets that you can use to monitor the health of the various Skype for Business components. Within the context of conferencing, we have 6 synthetic transactions that can be used to monitor, amongst other things, data conferences, the web scheduler, and dial-in conferencing. Conferencing administration online. Skype for Business Online conferencing administration is achieved through the Skype for Business Admin Center, which is part of the Office 365 Admin Center, or Skype for Business Online PowerShell commandlets. Summary. Following are a list of key learnings that you should take away from today's session. Meetings offer a wide array of capabilities, including audio, video, and web conferencing for up to 250 clients. Planning is critical to the success of a conferencing deployment. Ensure the network infrastructure is ready for the conferencing deployment. And finally, for on-premise deployments, always ensure that high availability and disaster recovery has been implemented for all components of the infrastructure. If you want to chat with your peers, ask questions, or just provide some feedback, you can always reach us at the Skype Operations Framework community, aka.ms/SOF community. If you want to stay up to date on the latest training releases, take a look at the Skype Operations Framework blog, aka.ms/SOF-blog.